Thank you, Jesus. There she speaks. Ooh, Jesus. For those of you who are watching by YouTube, when I downloaded on there, if you'd heard the worship, you know I'm having a hard time get going. Ooh. The message is obey or disobey. That's right, Numit. Oh, so we got our anesthesia. Oh. Hoping. Yeah. Okay. Oh, whew. What's that? Cool. Oh. Okay, when it comes to walking with God, one of the issues is with some Christians is obedience. God has expectations, and because he has those expectations, we have choices to make. God didn't create us to be a bunch of robots. He's given us the ability to choose whether we obey or disobey. One of the men that struggled with this issue is Jonah. Instead of admiring Jonah, we can find someone who might be like us. Even when Jonah finally does it right, like preaching finally to Nineveh, he does it wrong by getting angry at God. But the whole time, God is working within and around Jonah and accomplishing his purpose in him. Again, we see where God uses imperfect people, not perfect people. This is a story of a man of God that had a calling on his life, but who didn't want to obey God. But there are some great lessons we can learn from him. Jonah has received a mission from God, and his mission is to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach the message that God has given him. But there's a problem. Jonah doesn't like the mission. So he sends Jonah to warn the people of Nineveh that there's yet another judgment to come, and it's coming soon. But Jonah has no compassion for them at all. He wants to see them get what's coming to them. Isn't that a lot like us? We don't have as much mercy and grace as God does. Have you ever run in the opposite direction? I know I have. Let's be honest, we haven't always liked the missions that God has called us on. Be honest and say that when God has spoken to you, have you always wanted to obey him? When God said to start this church, I came up with every excuse why I couldn't. I said I never went to school to become a pastor. I said sometimes I stutter, can't think, one sentence thought. I just came up with all kinds of reasons why I couldn't do it. But God says, I can do it through you. Or he might ask you to do something, and you have family members who shun you for obeying God. I've had friends that have disowned me for obeying God. I've had Christians try to correct me when I obey God. One church I attended, I was taken in the office a lot. Felt like I was in school again, sent in the principal's office. God started reminding me of some things. Example was of one of my family members when my niece turned 21 years old. God told me to give her this. It was about the time that these were being made at Abundant Life on Texas Avenue by Nan Parson. And he says, I want you to put this in a package and give this to her on her 21st birthday. I knew that she wasn't going to like it. But I had the choice. Do I obey God or do I disobey him and care what my family really thinks? On it, if the people that don't know what it says Joel's Place, vintage now, Holy Ghost spirits, cost, give your life to the Lord. There's no limits on refills, a constant drunk, highly encouraged. Open 24/7, we never close. Bottled by J.C. Bottling Heaven, HG Enterprises, and I put 2010 because I actually made this one. But I knew she wasn't going to like it. But I did it. Never heard nothing about it. Right. Another thing is my other nieces and nephews. In the past, God has had me tell on their birthdays or whatever, give them some things that had to do with him. I knew they weren't going to like it, but I had the choice. Do I obey or disobey? And I gave them to them. And their mother, my sister, one year, it was when Christian Hafouche was here. And his wife wrote a book. I can't remember her name. Robin, is it? Robin Hafouche, about her testimony. He says, I want you to give that to her for her birthday. Yeah, she'll really receive this. But I wrote on the inside of it, don't even remember what I wrote, but I wrote something on the inside cover, and I gave it to her. I don't know the time frame in it, but I remember she wrote me a letter. It was maybe a month or two later, and told me that her family did not like some of the things I did, and to please stop doing them. It hurt. But am I going to please God? Or am I going to please them? My concern is their souls. And if they don't like, I can plant the seed, but I have the choice. Do I obey or disobey? Just like the morning when I ran around the church. I had the choice that morning. Do I obey God or do I get intimidated and my father's sitting beside me? And in Matthew 10:29, I'm going to read it from the Message. (29-42). What's the price of a pet canary? Some loose change, right? And God cares what happens to it even more than you do. He pays even greater attention to you, down to the last detail, even numbering the hairs on your head. So don't be intimidated by all this bully talk. You're worth more than 1,000,000 canaries. Stand up for me against world opinion, and I'll stand up for you before my Father in heaven. If you turn tail and run, do you think I'll cover for you? Don't think I'll come to make life cozy. I've come to cut. Make a sharp knife, cut between son and father, daughter and mother, bride and mother-in-law. Cut through those cozy domestic arrangements and free you for God. Well-meaning family members can be your worst enemies. If you prefer father or mother over me, you don't deserve me. If you prefer son or daughter over me, you don't deserve me. If you don't go all the way with me, through thick and thin, you don't deserve me. If your first concern is to look after yourself, you'll never find yourself. But if you forget about yourself and look to me, you'll find both yourself and me. We are intimately linked in this harvest work. Anyone who accepts what you do accepts me, the one who sent you. Anyone who accepts what I do accepts my Father who sent me. Accepting a message of God is as good as being God's messenger. Accepting someone's help is as good as giving someone help. This is a large work I've called you into, but don't be overwhelmed by it. It's best to start small. Give a cool cup of water to someone who's thirsty, for instance. The smallest act of giving or receiving makes you true. You won't lose out on a thing. That's from the Message Bible. Back to Jonah. He's running from God, so he goes down to Joppa, which was the nearest port to Jerusalem, and books his passage on a ship. It's amazing the lengths people will go when they're trying to escape from something. And for me, I know over my life, there's been plenty of times that I've run. So I can relate with Jonah on some things. God has given me messages before, and I've not wanted to give them. I've had my back and forth with God. People try all kinds of things to escape, but you can't escape from God. Psalm 139. Seven through 10. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the place of the dead, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell by the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me, and your strength will support me. Jonah thought he'd give it his best shot, and he went to great lengths to avoid his mission. His mission was to go hundreds of kilometers northeast to Nineveh, but instead he decided to sail to Tarshish, which was the western outskirts of the Mediterranean. But God doesn't give up. Just as well for us that we serve a gracious and merciful God. There's two reasons I believe that God didn't just give up on this mission. First, there was 120,000 people in Nineveh that he cared about. In Jonah 4:11. I know he's here. He's right by Micah, I remember that. Jonah 4:11. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people living in spiritual darkness, not to mention all the animals. Shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city? It doesn't matter what these people have done, God still cared about them. When it says people who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, that doesn't mean they were a race of morons. What God is getting at is that even though the people of Nineveh had brought themselves under the judgment of God, they had no idea what to do to get themselves back from under that judgment. They were totally helpless. So God intervenes and extends his grace to a heathen nation. The second reason I believe God wasn't prepared to give up was he had a plan and purpose for Jonah. Even though Jonah didn't care about the Ninevites, God still cared about this rebellious and small-minded prophet. In Jonah 1:4. But as the ship was sailing along, suddenly the Lord flung a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to send them to the bottom. The Hebrew word for sent out actually means hurled. It's the same word used in 1 Samuel 18:11, where King Saul hurled the spear at David and tried to pin him to the wall. I can imagine God saying, "Okay, Jonah, you think you're so smart going on your nice little cruise? Let's see how you handle this." So he hurls a great wind into the sea. What's God doing? He's trying to attract Jonah's attention. But does it work? No. Jonah's still not listening. In Jonah 1:5, fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. And all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So Jonah is actually sleeping. Even the unbelievers knew there's a problem, but Jonah is too busy sleeping. Jesus said in Luke 16:8, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light." Christians behave sometimes in the most idiotic ways. So and the world looks on shaking their heads and saying, I don't get it. These guys are dumber than dumb, and they're supposed to be Christians. Like Norm Robertson used to say, how dumb can you be and still breathe? I actually used to get offended when Norm Robertson would say that. Then one day God said it to me. I said, oh. I can't remember what I was doing, but he says, how dumb can you be and still breathe? Just remember, everything we do, someone is watching. One thing, Jonah isn't even praying. He's a man of God, and they're pagans, and they're the ones praying. But he's not talking to God. The captain even said to him, ask him to pray. Finally, the crew decides that the only thing that can resolve this problem is to draw lots and find out what's the cause of it. And Jonah is forced to fess up. Jonah 1:9, it says, so he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, and the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Jonah is being quite hypocritical. On one hand, he says that he fears Yahweh, but then in his in the middle course, he's in the middle of disobedience. The pagans show a lot more concern for Jonah than he did for them. They initially decide that they can't throw him overboard to a certain death. So they try to row to shore, but finally they're left with no choice. Jonah's chucked into the sea. And then God sends a fish, and Jonah went into the belly of the fish. Obeying God doesn't mean it will always turn out the way we want it to turn out. One of the things that God reminded me of sometimes when we don't know obeying him, how it's going to turn out, was my brother-in-law. Probably, I think he's been gone 2 years now. He was in the ICU at Easton, Maine, and I was believing that he was going to be healed. He was a man that, when he was a child, he had polio and couldn't walk. The doctors told him he would never walk again. He walked. His mother worked with him constantly until he was walking again. Then in 1968, when I was 7 years old, he was in the National Guard, and he was going, I think it was on Dixmont Hill. The whole line of the National Guard trucks were going up the hills, while some stupid idiot, sorry if you're watching, I don't know if they lived or not, but anyway, they come down the opposite direction. No, somebody decided to pass the whole line of National Guard trucks, and then there was somebody coming down over the hill. So my brother-in-law happened to be in the truck that got hit, and it rolled over onto him. And I remember we was at my grandparents' house when we got the phone call that he'd been in an accident. They had told him, he ended up going to, I think, the VA hospital in Boston. I think there's one in Boston. And he went there. They said he was going to be a vegetable, and if he did live, then he would never walk again. His twice. He was told he would never walk again. He walked. He had a steel plate in his leg. He wasn't a vegetable. So I was remembering all the things that happened to him previous. I mean, he'd been, after his accident, there was different times that, I mean, he drank, he got in other accidents and stuff. I mean, it's just a miracle that he survived to be in his 60s. He didn't have a spleen. So he was more capable of getting infections and stuff. So anyway, and that's what basically killed him. But I was believing, I says, God, if you could do that when he was a kid and you could do that when he was however old, then you can do it again. I said, he might have another 40 years left on him. So that's what I was believing for. But then one night, in the midst of all this, I dreamt about him. And in my dream, he said, my brother-in-law said to me, let me go. I'm tired. Tell them to let me go. So I got up the next morning, and I knew what I had to do. God says, I want you to put on, I had a badge that let me in Eastern Maine as a pastor to minister to people. He says, I want you to put on that badge, go to your sister, and tell her that you're there as her pastor, not her sister. And tell her what was said in your dream. So when I went there that morning, she was the only one there with him. And I sat down with her and I told her about the dream. And I said, he wants us to let him go. And I told her about being there as her pastor. Well, she let me pray with her. And then she told me that she wanted me to do the funeral. So, and then, of course, all the family showed up and stuff. And there was this one nurse at Eastern Maine that drove me foolish. She was constantly, she knew I was a pastor. She knew that we had church here in Bucksport and stuff. It was like she was antagonizing me at times. And I can't remember how long he was there, 3 or 4 days, I don't remember. But anyway, she kept saying, I want to hear you sing. I want to hear you sing. I says, I can't sing. But I want to hear you sing. She says, somebody needs to sing with him. And I kept telling her I couldn't sing. I said, you wouldn't want to hear me sing. And then I can't remember in the midst of that I can't remember if I did it that day or I think it was. Where I knew it was towards the end of him. And then I heard God say, sing. I said, oh, God. Here's my other sisters and my nieces and nephews out there. Finally I said, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, whatever. And then, I was singing pretty loud. Well, they shut the door. The nurse that was antagonizing me to sing all those days shut the door. I sang the whole song to him. And then I could feel in the atmosphere that I was being not received by some of my family. But at that point, my concern was more for him than anything they thought. Even though it was hard. And then he did pass that night. And then when they decided to do all the funeral and everything, the children stepped in and they wanted somebody else to do the service. And one of my sisters came to me, said, such and such nephew doesn't want you speaking at the funeral a lot of scriptures. We was able to share, but he didn't want me speaking a lot of scriptures. And I was like, I did share at his funeral, but I had to push through all that stuff of the family and not really care what they thought. And it's hard sometimes when I'm around my family to know that I'm being judged on things. And it's like, I've even had the thought, geez, I was judged when I drank, and now I'm a Christian and I'm doing right. But that's all right. Because we have the choice. I could let all those feelings of knowing, I didn't know the outcome of a lot of that. But some I did. You know what I'm saying? Back to Jonah. Is it actually possible to be swallowed by a great fish or a whale and survive? God is not limited to the natural. I believe there's a miracle of God intervening grace. God is a God of second chances. Jonah 3, 1 through 2. Then the Lord spoke to Jonah a second time. Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh and deliver the message of judgment I have given you. God graciously gives Jonah a second chance to fulfill the mission. Reminds me of Jesus and Peter in John 21, 15 through 17. Peter has denied the Lord 3 times, and I guess he's really not sure what kind of reception he's going to receive from Jesus. And Jesus asks him 3 times, do you love me? Each time Peter says yes, and each time Jesus recommissions Peter. 3 times Peter denied Jesus, 3 times Jesus recommissioned Peter. God is a God of second chances, but we ought not to take that second chance for granted. We can't just toy with God and treat him lightly, because there's no guarantees that we'll get that second chance. Like in the story in 1 Kings 13. Look where his disobedience got this man of God. Jeroboam is the king of Israel. He's not walking with God, so God sends a man of God who isn't even named to prophesy against the altar that Jeroboam is using. Jeroboam is very angry and stretches out his hand towards the man of God and says, arrest him. And as soon as he does, his hand withers. He then asks the man of God to pray for him so that he can be healed. So the man of God prays for him, and his hand is restored. The king is so impressed that he invites the man of God to go back to his place and eat with him. But the man of God refuses because God has told him he isn't allowed to eat or drink anything in that place, so he leaves. The second part of the story is there's an old prophet in town who hears about the prophecy. He gets his sons to saddle his donkey and chase off after the man of God. When he catches up with him, he invites him to come back to his place to eat. The man of God tells the old prophet exactly what he told the king. Then the old prophet does something else. He lies. He tells the man of God that he's a prophet too, and that an angel appeared to him and told him to bring back the man of God for a meal. The man of God believes him, goes back to his place, and has a meal there. Now the old prophet gets a genuine word from the Lord. He prophesies that since the man of God disobeyed his instructions from God, he would be eaten by a lion. That's exactly what happened. He didn't even get a second chance. God is a God of grace, but he often gives second chances, but there's no guarantees. Back to Jonah. Jonah got a second chance from God to fulfill his mission in Jonah 3:3. This time Jonah obeyed the Lord command and went to Nineveh, a city so large that it took 3 days to see it all. In Jonah 3:5 through 9. The people of Nineveh believed God's message, and from the greatest to the least, they decided to go without food and wear sackcloth to show their sorrow. When the king of Nineveh heard what Jonah was saying, he stepped down from his throne and took off his royal robes. He dressed himself in sackcloth and sat on a heap of ashes. Then the king and his nobles sent his decree throughout the city. No one, not even the animals, may eat or drink anything at all. Everyone is required to wear sackcloth and pray earnestly to God. Everyone must turn from their evil ways and stop all their violence. Who can tell? Perhaps even yet God will have pity on us and hold back his fierce anger from destroying us. Jonah entered the city of Nineveh, like I said, from the western side and preached his message, then exited on the east side. He chose a spot to sit down and wait to see what would happen to the city. He was probably hoping that they wouldn't get grace and mercy. So Jonah managed to scrape together some clay and some sticks and make himself a little hut, just like Gilligan's Island. But it's not enough. God causes a plant to grow up to give him shade. Jonah is very happy until God causes a worm to kill the plant. The sun is beating down on Jonah's head, literally to say that the sun is attacking his head. And Jonah gets angry and falls into a deep depression. In Jonah 4:10-11, which I read 11 already, but then the Lord said, "You feel sorry about the plant, though you did nothing to put it there. And a plant is only at best short-lived. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people living in spiritual darkness, not to mention all the animals. Shouldn't I feel sorry for such a great city?" Jesus said, "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" That's Mark 8:36. God is calling us to wholehearted obedience. My point, I feel, is God is saying to us, do we want to obey wholeheartedly or half-heartedly? We've all done things like Jonah and heard from God and not wanted to obey. God is looking for willing hearts that will obey. Through disobedience, Saul lost his kingship. Although he had put so much time and energy into working for God, God is not interested in our self-chosen work and sacrifices, even when we say we're doing it for him. When Saul clearly refused to obey the command of the Lord, Samuel reminded him to obey is better than sacrifice. Obedience is pure love for God. Disobedience is a selfish desire to satisfy our own egos. When we look at the people of Israel, we see the consequences of disobedience. Through disobedience, the people of God turned away from God, and most of the Israelites died in the desert. The man who says, "I know him," but does not do what he commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. That's 1 John 2:4. If you claim to know God, but your life is not changed by knowing him, then it's a certain sign that you don't know God. He is not saying that the truth is in one's head and has not made it to their hearts. He's saying that the people who does not keep God's command does not have the truth at all. Why? Because the truth of God turns our hearts upside down. It changes us. It transforms us. Once you have the truth, it fills you with a fire in your belly and love for the living God. It changes everything. God's truth always leads to love. What my family doesn't know is the things that I've done it from love. Partial obedience equals disobedience. We don't like the whole concept of obedience. We'd rather be obeyed than not obey. This happens in a lot of marriages. Obedience is always hard. It's always difficult. It always has to do with sacrifice, which has to do with giving up something, losing something. It's not always popular. If you're willing and obedient, you will eat the best from the land. Are we willing and obedient to do what God says? Or are we more obedient to suffer the consequences. No wonder God gave us anesthesia first. That's all I have. Jean, can you close us in prayer?
Let's just be in the spirit of prayer. Father God, we praise your name. You are awesome, God. We are so grateful for the grace that you apply to our wounds, that oil of grace, those second chances. And Father, we're so grateful for your forgiveness when your children are disobedient, Lord. We just lift up your name. We lift up your name to glorify you, to give you praise, and to thank you for all you do for us, especially for your great love that does bring us second chances and does soothe over those difficult places in our lives with your grace. So today, as we leave this place, as we go off the air, as we head back into life outside of this sanctuary, Father God, we ask that your Holy Spirit continue to go with us, that you continue to surround us with your love and your peace and your grace. And in return, Lord God, give us the strength, the love, the power to be obedient to your word, and help us, Father God, to hear you clearly so that we can be obedient the first time you speak. We'll give you all the praise and all